Abdominopelvic cavity. We are shifting gears, moving downstream on the body. So we will talk about the borders of the abdominopelvic cavity. I know last week we talked about hernias. We talked about that's a big injury for the abdomen because of all the internal pressures that allow for those weaknesses to be exploited. So now we look at the actual borders of the abdominopelvic cavity. There we go. Laser pointer now, it's official. All right. So if you'll notice, the abdominopelvic cavity, I know everybody always says abdomen, everybody always says pelvis, but these guys are connected. The abdominopelvic cavity is absolutely connected. Okay, so we have to talk about the borders, and then we'll talk about the separation between these two areas. You'll notice that superiorly and inferiorly, that the abdominopelvic cavity is bordered by a diaphragm. You have the pelvic floor diaphragm, and you also have the respiratory diaphragm. So you've got a diaphragm up top and down low that are your borders, superior and inferior. Now along the anterior side, there's lots of things that you could include for these borders because there's a lot that's happening in the abdomen, but we're looking at the body wall specifically, right? So on the anterior side of the body wall, what's the muscle that we would most associate with the more midline of the anterior? Which muscle? Rectus abdominis, that's exactly right. So if you're looking at a muscular border, you're talking about the rectus abdominis on the anterior side. Now on either of the two lateral sides, you've got the three lateral muscles, right? So you have the external oblique, internal oblique, transversus abdominis. So those guys would be your big borders on the lateral side, but I'll give you a little bit of a hint. They're also a little bit part of the posterior because most of these muscles do have an origin from posterior and then they wrap around to the front. So even though they are the full lateral border, they also contribute a little bit posteriorly, right? So don't get confused by that, but they do contribute to it. And then you've got other things posteriorly that we'll see today. Of course, you got the spinal cord, you've got the vertebral column that's along the posterior side. So that's, if you're looking for a big bony structure, a big landmark, you definitely can use the vertebral bodies. You can use the spinal cord if you wanted to, the intervertebral discs, all that good stuff for a posterior border. And you'll also notice that how you have the color difference here between the abdomen and the pelvis. There's a very specific ridge along the pelvis called the arcuate line. Wow, that sounds a little familiar, right? Arcuate line. There's more than one arcuate line throughout the body just to confuse you, right? So the arcuate line in this case is the bony ridge that not only divides the pelvis into a false and a true pelvis, but it also divides the abdominopelvic cavity into the abdomen and the pelvis below that arcuate line. Okay? So we've got borders that are superior, inferior, anterior, posterior, and lateral for the abdominopelvic cavity, but we also have that bony ridge, the arcuate line of the pelvis, that subdivides the abdominopelvic cavity into the abdomen and the pelvis. Now the peritoneum, I know we mentioned this last week. We mentioned again just briefly on this slide, because remember, as we said before, the peritoneum is nothing more than the lining that is along the inside of the abdominopelvic cavity. If it's against the wall, it's the parietal peritoneum. If it's against the organ, it's the visceral peritoneum. So by now, all this stuff should sound very familiar, right? Okay, so move to the next slide. We're going to take it a step further, 2 steps further. So we know what peritoneum is, right? We just talked about the 2 layers. So the first terms that you notice up here are retroperitoneal and intraperitoneal. All right, so what are we talking about? Something that is retroperitoneal means that it is behind the peritoneal lining. Okay, it's behind the peritoneal lining, which means if I cut you along the linea alba, that avascular line that connects from where to where? Xiphoid process? Symphysis pubis, that's exactly right. So if I cut you along the linea alba and I stick my hand in the abdomen, I'm touching the organs, I'm touching the visceral peritoneum because it's on the organ, right? So I'm able to touch it, that's on the organ, that's the visceral peritoneum. So the parietal peritoneum, of course, meaning that's the wall, so that's on the anterior wall, it's on the lateral wall, but it's also along the posterior wall because it just means wall. So for something to be retroperitoneal, that means it's got to be behind or outside of the parietal peritoneum. So that doesn't happen so much on the anterior or on the lateral sides, but it definitely happens on the posterior sides. 1 second. My daughter can take it here. Hello, Chris. Sorry about that. I see a number that pops up. I thought it was daycare. So retroperitoneal means it is behind the parietal peritoneum. So not so much on the anterior or the lateral side, but more so we talk about this in reference to the posterior side of the abdomen. Now, when we think about the abdominal organs, I know you haven't, unless you've studied this before or looked at the diagrams, you haven't really seen it, but the organs have a lot of twisting. There's a lot of torsion that takes place within the abdomen. So during development, the abdominal contents are too large for the belly. Okay, so they have to herniate out into space. They rotate about 280 degrees before the body is able to be large enough to accommodate those organs to come back in. So once they do the 280-ish degrees of rotation, then they recede back into the body. So that's how you kind of get this twisted look to some of these organs. Now that's relevant to us now, but also when we talk about the primary versus secondarily retroperitoneal. So in organs like the kidney, in this case, an organ like the kidney is a retroperitoneal structure. It's a very classic example of a retroperitoneal structure. It was never in the abdominal cavity. It sits in the abdominopelvic area, but it's retroperitoneal. So if I was going to have any type of kidney surgery, you would not want the doctor to go from anterior because it is a retroperitoneal structure. So what you would do is, has anybody had kidney issues before, kidney surgeries, transplants, anything like that? Your father had a transplant? Had kidney stones? Now kidney stones is a little different because usually they'll go through the ureter to bust those up to get those to drain out. But if you're actually taking the kidney itself and having a replacement, they have to go in from the flank. They go in from the back. You have to disrupt a couple of the muscles, but then the kidney is sitting there, right? There's 2 layers of fascia that surround the kidney that make it really thick, and I think you can see here that it's pretty thick around the kidney on either side. But it's behind this lining, it's behind that parietal peritoneum, so that is a classic example of a retroperitoneal organ. Okay? Now, that being said, does everybody understand intra versus retro? Pretty straightforward. Where people have a little bit more issue is the primary versus secondary. Have you guys heard those terms before? Primarily retroperitoneal, secondarily retroperitoneal? A primary retroperitoneal structure is a structure like the kidney that originated retroperitoneal, and then once the guts herniate, rotate, and then recede back to the belly, they remain retroperitoneal, right? So a primarily retroperitoneal structure never is involved with the intraperitoneal area. It's never involved in the abdominopelvic cavity. It stays behind that peritoneal lining. But something that is secondarily retroperitoneal tells you that it used to be considered primary, it used to be in the abdominopelvic cavity, and then because of this rotation, it gets pushed behind that peritoneal lining, the parietal, making it secondarily retro. So we said that the kidneys are a good example of something that is primarily retro, because they started retro and they end up retro. But something like the ascending and the descending colon, those are good examples of something that's secondarily retro. Because during that herniation, the ascending, descending colon is out there with the rest of the small intestine and large intestine. During that herniation, the ascending and descending colon is one of the first organs that get pushed back into the belly. So when they get pushed into the belly, all the other organs that are coming back and sort of pile in on top of it, which means those guys get pushed further and further and further into the back of the belly, which means eventually they get embedded into that that posterior wall, which is the parietal peritoneum. So that means part of the ascending, part of the descending is retroperitoneal. Part of it is also intraperitoneal because it does get embedded into the wall. Okay? So that makes it secondarily retroperitoneal. It didn't start off that way, but because of that rotation and then the regression back into the belly, it ended up that way. Does that make sense? So understanding the differences between intra and retro is good, and then also the primary versus secondary. There's got to be a written question there somewhere. It just sounds too good to miss, right? I agree. Now, when you take away the anterior abdominal wall, this is sort of the first look of what you would see into the belly. And if you wanted to, you could use your quadrant view again if you just kind of want to draw that in there, just to give you an idea, you know, the right upper, right lower, left lower, just to kind of see what is sort of in that area. Two main things to look at first here. The first one we'll talk about is this structure, the greater omentum. The greater omentum is nothing more than fat. It's just fat. It's a big sheet of fat that hangs from the stomach and the transverse colon. Now, why in the world do we simply just have a big sheet of fat covering the abdominal contents? What's the purpose here? Protection. Over here where it says it's nicknamed the nurse or the policeman of the abdomen. What this means is that if you happen to have some sort of injury within the belly, okay, let's say you have something like appendicitis. The appendix is in the right lower quadrant. Say the appendix happens to burst. Now you got bad stuff leaking out, right? The greater omentum will find that leak, it'll find the appendix, and it will clump. It will ball up together and sort of wall off that area to keep that infection in a tight little pocket instead of allowing it to spread. Because infection that spreads inside the belly is called sepsis. And I don't know if you guys are familiar with death certificates, but we see a lot of sepsis on death certificates, okay? So anytime you've got infection that starts to have free reign wherever it wants to go in the abdominal pelvic cavity, it's not a good thing. It's not a good thing. People can turn septic pretty quick, right? So the greater omentum, its job is to find that injury, find that insult, and make it as little of a problem as possible. Try to minimize the issue. But also in this case, you're also introduced to an area called the greater sac. Now there is a greater sac and a lesser sac, and we'll talk about both of these. But everything that you're looking at this point is considered to be the greater sac. Now, the only reason that I mention these guys more so is because of the lesser sac and fluid drainage throughout the belly. And the reason that is relevant is just for what we just said. If you have some type of infection, you have some sort of inflammatory process, you have an increase of the secretions within the belly, right? So there should always be a little bit of synovial fluid that lines all of these organs to allow for free movement, because the guts are always rolling, they're always moving. So you need that to be as slick as possible so you don't develop adhesions, right? But the greater sac is, again, if you take your hand and just place it into the belly at this point, not only are you touching the physical structure of the visceral peritoneum on the organ, your hand is also considered to be in the greater sac. The greater sac in this case is just the area that is surrounding these organs. Because there should be fluid that is washing over all of these organs, like we talked about. And the whole purpose of this is that as these fluids wash downstream, they run along something called gutters. Paracolic gutters. It's a little gutter that runs on each side of the ascending and the descending colon. And it's formed by where the parietal peritoneum folds over to try to become the visceral. So as it's folding over to reach the organ, it forms like a little trough. I got you. It forms a little trough on either side. So here in this greater sac, fluid that washes across will collect in these gutters, and it pulls it down towards the pelvis. And that's relevant to us because if we want to sample that fluid to see if there's sepsis, to see if there's some sort of inflammatory process, we need to get that fluid to collect so we can sample it. And lower pelvis is the best place to do that, because you can either go through the vagina, you can either go through the rectum to to sample that fluid. And we'll talk about some of these pouches in just a little bit. You had a question?
Yeah, I'm kind of confused with between the parietal peritoneum and the visceral peritoneum.
Parietal just means wall. Okay, so the parietal would be, if you had the belly here and you open it up, the parietal is just out here on the wall. Visceral means it's on the organ. So if I can grab greater abdomen, stomach, small, large intestine, that's the visceral peritoneum. That's all visceral. Yes. Because visceral itself means organ. Parietal itself means wall. So it's just kind of telling you, the location of that line.
But it's still like the parietal peritoneum is still deep. The muscles, correct?
From this, yes, it is deep to the muscles, that's right, because think about this, it's actually deep to the transversalis fascia. If you go in from an anterior view, it is deep to the transversalis fascia. Remember below the arcuate line, you can see the transversalis fascia. If you go beyond that, technically you would hit the parietal peritoneum, and then you're in the belly. Now we mentioned the greater omentum, and we mentioned the greater sac. Because if you take the greater omentum, remember we said that it hangs from the stomach and the large intestine here, specifically the transverse colon. So we've taken the greater omentum here, kind of pulled it up, and in this case it's been removed. Right? So you no longer have the greater omentum. You're disrupting the greater sac, but then again you've also got these organs sort of pushed to the side. The small intestine is missing. But all of this is still considered greater sac. So all of this area is this fluid accumulating area that allows it to wash down towards the pelvis. But the lesser sac is a small little area that is deep to this structure, and that structure is the lesser omentum. So if you have a greater omentum, you gotta have a lesser, right? And they tell you. But in this case, the lesser omentum doesn't really hang from anywhere. It's not being suspended. It's just sort of spanning across an area. And in this case, it forms the roof of the lesser sac. So if you look at what this ligament is connecting, it's connecting liver over towards the duodenum, liver towards the stomach. So the names tell you everything you need to know. The hepatoduodenal, the hepatogastric. So the portion of this ligament that goes from the liver down to the duodenum, hepatoduodenum. The portion that goes to the stomach, hepatogastric. Right? Collectively, it's called the lesser omentum. Then the little area that is deep to that is called the lesser sac. It's a small pocket. Greater sac is huge. Lesser sac, very small. It's a pocket that has one way in and one way out. And that's what that omental foramen is. You can take your finger, run it in the omental foramen, and then you can push out against the inside of the lesser omentum. So that means your finger's in the lesser sac. Now why is that relevant? It's a pocket that's tucked way back in there, okay? But again, if you want to test the fluid, if you want to sample the fluid, you need to get as much fluid down into the pelvis as possible to sample it, so you got to get it out of this area as well, right? Anatomical position. You see the position of the lesser sac and the omental foramen here. It's almost horizontal. So what you have to do is you have to ask the patient to roll over on the right side a little bit. That allows the fluid that's inside of here to wash out towards the right side of the body. So once you've rolled over to the right side, sit there for a minute, then allow the patient to sit up, because then that takes all the fluid out of the lesser sac, pushes it over towards the liver, and then when you sit up, those fluids will wash down along the gutter on the right side, down towards the pelvis. So it sounds like it's a lot of talking just to try to sample some fluid, right? But like I say, sepsis is a big cause of death. Either primary cause of death or a secondary cause of death. We see it on a lot of death certificates. So sampling the fluid that's in the abdominopelvic cavity is kind of a big deal. And this is the best way to get the best representation of the fluid is to get it to wash on that greater sac, but understand that you need to get it out of the lesser as well. Okay? Much more clinically relevant than it is grossly, but still very relevant. Does that make sense? Yeah? Now, a mesocolon versus a mesentery. What are we saying? The body doesn't like things to float in free space. So especially in the abdomen, you've got portions of this parietal peritoneum that will stretch out towards the organs. So not only is it holding that organ in place, but it also provides a bridge for arteries, veins, nerves, and lymphatics to travel back and forth from the posterior wall to the organ. So when you talk about a mesentery, you're talking about the structure that holds the small intestine against the body wall. Okay? Mesentery holds the small intestine to the body wall. The small intestine has three parts: duodenum, jejunum, and ileum. The jejunum and ileum are very free moving. Okay? The duodenum has a little bit more of tethering to it, but the jejunum and the ileum are very free moving. So this mesentery, this root of the mesentery that you see here, stretches out from this view, wraps around the small intestine, and then wraps back to the body wall. And like we said, that provides that bridge for the communication for all the vessels, the nerves, etc. Okay? So mesentery holds the small intestine against the posterior wall. Mesocolon holds the colon, the large intestine, to the body wall. But not all of the large intestine. Because remember we said earlier that only portions of the large intestine are secondarily retroperitoneal, ascending and descending. So since the ascending and the descending colon are already pushed back and embedded into that parietal peritoneum, they're already tethered to the body wall, so they don't need to be tethered again, right? They're already pushed back into it. So that's why you don't see any connection associated with the ascending or the descending colon, because they are secondarily retro. Whereas things like the transverse colon that's missing, the transverse colon has a transverse mesocolon to help hold it in place. There's also the distal part of the colon here called the sigmoid. It's the S-shaped part of the large intestine. It has a sigmoid mesocolon because it is very movable. So it has to be tethered back to the body wall. So that's kind of bringing back that secondarily retro thing when you're talking about ascending, descending colon. Does it make sense? I mean, this is a lot of terms. Are you lost? Talk to me. Talk to me. Come on. You're paying for this.
I need to re-listen through it and figure out.
The key to this slide is that it's showing you ascending and descending colon and how they are secondarily retroperitoneal. Right? So since they are embedded into the body wall, they don't need a mesocolon to hold them to the body wall because they're already in it. But things like the transverse colon and the sigmoid colon are not embedded into the body wall, so they need that tether. And that's how you get a transverse mesocolon or a sigmoid mesocolon. Now, the bulk, the vast majority of the small intestine is free floating. So that's why the mesentery attaches to the small intestine, almost all of it. That's kind of the big take home right there. Mesocolon versus mesentery. Mesentery is only small, mesocolon is only large intestine. Yes?
Is there any word that's like fully secondary?
They fully secondarily.
Where it seems like the form out.
No, because if you were fully secondarily retro, I think that's implying that you would have been primarily retro in the first place.
Yeah.
So I might be wrong, check behind me, but I can't think of anything that is a full secondarily retro. I can't think of that. Not saying it doesn't exist, I just can't think of it. It's a good question, but I can't think of it if it is. But I like where your head's at. Is everybody somewhat clear? Greater, lesser sac, mesentery, mesocolon. Now, you guys have heard of the alimentary canal before. You heard that term before? It's mouth to anus. The alimentary canal is the mouth to anus. You take a bite of food, you swallow it once, hopefully just once, and then you forget about it, and you see it 8 hours later, right? So what happens? There's other things that are happening in this process. So the alimentary canal and all the other organs that are associated in the abdominal pelvic cavity are divided up into 3 different portions. Have you guys heard of these terms before? They're called the foregut, the midgut, and the hindgut. You've heard that before, some of you? Foregut, midgut, hindgut. What we're saying here is we're talking about different portions of this alimentary canal, and we're talking about different portions of the organs that have an effect on the different three pieces of the alimentary canal. So another way of looking at that is breaking down just what exactly are we talking about. So foregut is mouth down to the second part of the duodenum. So really what we're looking at here is mouth, esophagus, stomach, and then after we pass through the stomach, that's where we reach the duodenum, which is the first part of the small intestine. So we're really just talking about mouth down to the second portion or the second part of the duodenum. So here you see the esophagus where it pokes through. It would bury itself into the stomach, which is left upper quadrant. Stomach circles back around, and we'll see each organ individually in just a minute. But then after you pass through the stomach, at that point you are now in the beginning of the small intestine, right? The duodenum is the beginning of the small intestine. And there's 4 pieces to the duodenum, right? So the end of the second portion of the duodenum, which you see here, it's also called the descending. That is the end of the foregut. So let's talk about the borders first, and then we'll kind of fill in the details as we go, right? Now the midgut picks up where the foregut left off, makes sense. So the third and fourth portion of the duodenum, all the way down through the small intestine, the beginning of the large intestine with the ascending colon and the transverse, all the way out to this bend, which happens at the spleen, so it's nicknamed the splenic flexure of the large intestine. So the midgut is very big, it's very long. Third portion of the duodenum, the rest of the small intestine, and then the ascending and the transverse colon, which is the large intestine, all the way out to the splenic flexure. Which means hindgut is really just the descending colon, which you see here, descending colon, the sigmoid down towards the rectum. So the hindgut has the least amount of responsibility, the midgut has the most, and foregut is sort of the middle. But those are your divisions. That's the big picture divisions of how you divide up the alimentary canal and the organs that are associated with each of those 3 portions: foregut, midgut, hindgut, and knowing those borders. So the first thing we'll talk about is the actual organs of the foregut. Now, as we mentioned before, we talked about esophagus, we talked about the stomach briefly, down towards the proximal portion of the duodenum, right? So all of that is the foregut. But there's a few other things that are associated here. So first off, let's start off with the stomach. You see the esophagus travels downstream, and then at this point you're right at what's called the cardia of the stomach. The cardia of the stomach is where the esophagus dumps its contents into the stomach. Now, like I said before, kind of being funny, but if you think about it, you swallow a bolus of food, a bite of food, you only swallow it one time, right? And then everything else sort of happens on its own. It passes down into the esophagus, it passes down to the stomach, small bowel, large bowel, and then eventually you use the energy, you use the nutrients, or you excrete the waste. I mean, that's the big picture of how this works, right? So you swallow it once and you forget about it. So it passes through the esophagus, down through this cardiac notch, which is this small little area that's associated with the cardia. Then at that point, you're in the stomach. Now, inside the stomach, it's got different portions to it. I don't want us to get caught up in each of the individual portions of the stomach. I want you to understand and learn the big picture more so than you can identify the 4th portion of the stomach. Congratulations. Great. I do want to mention one thing called the fundus. I do want to mention that. And the reason I mention the fundus is that in normal circumstances, there's a small air bubble that lives inside of the fundus. And that's important to us because without that air bubble, you can't have proper digestion. Because digestion actually begins in the mouth. It doesn't really begin necessarily down in the stomach with all the acidity. It actually begins in the mouth. So with this air bubble, it allows for there still to be a little bit of extra room in the stomach that allows for the stomach to sort of churn back and forth against itself. Without that air bubble, I guess you could relatively completely fill the stomach, which means then it couldn't grind on itself the way it needs to. It couldn't properly begin to digest the food. So you need that air bubble, and it usually lives in the fundus. Now on the inside of the stomach, you can cut this open, and you'll see folds called rugae. I know you guys have probably heard of that before, right? These are the folds along the inside of the stomach. Now, what's the purpose of having these folds? Why not just have the stomach? Why not just have the smooth muscle traveling downstream towards the duodenum? What's the purpose of the folds? Increase the surface area. That's exactly right. Increasing the surface area not only allows it to process the food a little bit quicker, more efficiently, but it also provides more surface area, which means it now has, for lack of better terms, it has a bigger working area. So it has more workers in there to process the food and push it downstream. And that'll come back to us when we talk about the small bowel as well. So it passes through the stomach, eventually working its way down towards the pylorus, which is the end of the stomach. And that's why you'll see what's something called the pyloric sphincter. The pyloric sphincter is a rounded muscle that allows the contents of the stomach to pass down into the duodenum. All right, so look at liver for a second. Liver is in the right upper quadrant. When you think of the liver, you think of a big picture thing like secretion of bile, creation of bile. So what does bile do? It's like dial soap. It's like soap that you would wash your dishes with. It breaks down fats, emulsification of fats. Okay? And you guys live in the stroke belt. I think we've talked about this before. We eat some pretty bad stuff around here. Because if you're like me and you like Bojangles and McDonald's, yeah, my stomach and my liver work overtime. Gallbladder too, right? But it helps to break down these fats. Okay, so fatty diet. Sometimes you eat like a big barbecue plate. It just feels like it sticks in your stomach for hours. It's because it's so fatty that the bile has to catch up to be able to break down these fats to help you push it downstream. So until it's able to catch up and produce enough of this bile, the food just sits there. So that's why you feel like, man, this is taking forever to push downstream. Well, that's because it is. So that tells you, don't eat the chopped barbecue, because that's where you get the most fat. That's a little word to the wise there. Go for the chunky, there's less fat. You're welcome for that, by the way. Now, the liver has two main lobes to it. Of course, you have a right and a left lobe. And it's separated by something called the falciform ligament. Falciform just means sickle shaped. So this is sort of a sickle shaped ligament that divides the right and left lobe. And then all the way down at the bottom of the falciform, you'll notice that it thickens into what looks like just a small structure. But that is called the ligamentum teres, the round ligament of the liver. Ligamentum teres of the liver, round ligament of the liver. That used to be a vein. It's no longer functional. So it scleroses and just becomes another fake ligament, kind of like ligamentum arteriosum. It's no longer needed, it hardens, so it's just a remnant from a former working vessel. So falciform ligament leads down to the ligamentum teres. Round ligament for the liver. It was a vein. It was the old obliterated umbilical vein that worked its way back up. Yep. Now that's just the anterior view of the liver. If you look on the inferior surface of it, you're introduced to two more lobes, two smaller lobes, called the quadrate and the caudate. Now the quadrate sits right beside the gallbladder, and we'll talk about the gallbladder in just a second. But the quadrate sits beside the gallbladder, and it always helped me to remember this because I always thought of 4 stones in the gallbladder. So quadrate 4, quadrate lobe is right beside the gallbladder. Whereas the caudate lobe sits right beside the inferior vena cava, so CC, caudate cava. But we're not going to go into more detail about the lobes of the liver because clinically there's close to 20 different segments within the liver. But for our purposes, we talk about the production of bile, and we'll also talk a little bit more about absorption and detoxification later on. So we're going to leave it at sort of the big picture, the hot ticket items right now. Now the liver is unique to the rest of the organs in that you can destroy 90% of your liver and it will regenerate. It may not come back in the same shape that it was before, but it will regenerate to become a functional liver. So researchers are trying to figure out how to make other organs sort of have those same capabilities. So if, of course, if you could find out a way to do that with something like the spinal cord or nerves, that would be a life changer for a lot of people. So they're trying to figure out what it is specifically about the liver that's able to do that versus the other organs not being able to. It doesn't give you an excuse to drink more, people. You're laughing. Some of you are like, damn. Now you're introduced to the gallbladder and something called the biliary tree. The gallbladder and the biliary tree. Now the gallbladder does nothing but store bile. So the bile is produced in the liver. Let's say that some of this bile is not needed at the moment, so the bile passes downstream into the gallbladder where it's stored. So when you do go to Rib Fest and you eat way too much greasy stuff, you've got this reservoir of bile that's ready to go, so those ribs just don't stick up underneath your ribs for about 8 hours, right? So the way this works, here you see the gallbladder, and anytime you hear gallbladder, think of cystic. Cystic and gallbladder are synonymous, right? So the gallbladder, the cystic region, and we call it the biliary tree because it's funneling the bile downstream into the small intestine. So from the liver, you have what's called a right and left hepatic duct. And it's draining the bile that was formed into the liver down into a structure called the common hepatic duct, which tells you all it's doing is taking the two hepatic ducts, merging them together into one. So the right-left hepatic duct, they merge together into the common hepatic duct. The gallbladder is here, so the gallbladder has a duct as well to drain its contents. That's the cystic duct. So once the cystic duct merges with the common hepatic, at that point you have a common bile duct. Now you guys have probably heard of common bile duct before, but you may not have heard of some of the other smaller ducts. But this is all in reference to the biliary tree, right? So right-left hepatics, they merge into one common hepatic. The cystic duct then merges into the common hepatic, forming common bile. Common bile duct at that point drains into the second portion of the duodenum, which allows the bile, the emulsification of fat content, right? That dumps it into the duodenum to help out with the food that has just been passed through the stomach down into the duodenum. So that's why oftentimes it feels like it's sticking in your stomach, because most of the bile doesn't kick in until after your stomach. So that greasy food takes longer to process. It stays in your stomach longer. Once it gets down into the small intestine, you're much better off. Okay, so it just takes longer for it to process its way through the stomach. But that enters in at the second portion of the duodenum, which just happens to be the end of the foregut. Funny how that worked out. Now in this same region, you've also got the pancreas. So of course, when you think of the pancreas, you're thinking of insulin regulation, right? You think of people that have diabetes. Anybody here diabetic? No? So of course you think of insulin regulation when you think of the pancreas. But those enzymes also need to be dumped into the small intestine. So the common bile duct comes downstream, and see here it's just called the bile duct. Common bile duct, same thing. You'll see that the common bile duct comes downstream, dumps into the second portion of the duodenum at a structure called the major duodenal papilla. And it looks like a small nipple, so they named it the nipple of the duodenum, the major duodenal papilla. There is a smaller one up top for an accessory. You don't always see that, okay? So don't focus on that so much. But the common bile duct does dump into the second part of the duodenum through that major duodenal papilla. And again, it's a sphincter. So just like the pyloric sphincter, how it systematically allows contents from the stomach to be passed down into the duodenum, same thing's happening here. This systematically will open and close, which allows a little bit of the bile duct contents to dump into the duodenum. But you'll also notice here with the pancreas how you'll have the head that sits in this C loop of the duodenum, and then you have the body and the tail heading out more towards the left upper quadrant. There's also a main pancreatic duct that's dumping all of its enzymes, draining it back towards this major duodenal papilla as well. But you'll notice that this doesn't really merge hardly at all with the common bile duct. It's really just sneaking in right at the very end to dump its contents into that major duodenal papilla. So that being said, the main pancreatic duct isn't considered to be part of the biliary tree because it ain't draining bile, right? Pancreatic enzymes. So if you're thinking biliary tree, you're just thinking liver gallbladder. Once you get the main pancreatic duct involved, then at that point you've got sort of the full drainage through the papilla, but not just the common bile duct. Now, pancreatic cancer. Pancreatic cancer is a killer, right? Do you know of anybody that in your family that has had pancreatic cancer? Have you guys been exposed to that before? She has it now. It's a killer, and there's just no other way to say that. And the reason is, it's not that pancreatic cancer is much more lethal than the rest of cancers. The problem is that where the pancreas is located, it takes longer for the symptoms to come to the surface. It takes longer for those symptoms to be seen. And just like with any disease, with a cavity in your tooth, if you're able to take care of it soon, it's a small filling. If you let it go too long, it's a root canal, right? So with cancer, the quicker you can catch it, the quicker you can treat it, the better your chance for survival, right? But since these symptoms are masked for so long, they can oftentimes just look like indigestion, just vague abdominal pain, which might be gas, you know? So since it takes so long for these symptoms to develop and to be seen, usually you're progressed further into the disease, which at that point it's hard to overcome. So that's why if you hear pancreatic cancer being such a killer, it's not more lethal, it's just more lethal only because the symptoms are being masked, because of the location of the organ. Now the spleen is also up in this area, okay? It's also up in this foregut. The whole purpose of the spleen is a warehouse. It's a repair shop for the red blood cell. So not only does the spleen have blood to make it work, it's also repairing the red blood cells. So it is a very vascular organ. There was a quarterback for the Tampa Bay Bucks about 10 years ago. You guys may remember him. His name was Chris Sims. May not. But he had a lacerated spleen during the game. Okay, he got tackled. He's playing the Panthers. Got tackled, lacerated his spleen. Everybody was like, man, that hit wasn't that hard. He just got hit from the back a little bit, and then he just didn't get up. Well, it's because he was bleeding out. So it's a very vascular organ that can rupture pretty quickly because the capsule is very thin. It's very important to us, but it's a very thin, very vascular organ. Do you have a question? He survived. Yeah, he survived. Yeah. So I'm not going to get into much more detail about the foregut because we got more stuff to cover. Now the midgut and the hindgut. The organs for the midgut, remember we said that it's the third portion of the duodenum. It's all the small intestine, and it's some of the large intestine, right? All the way out to the splenic flexure. Then the hindgut is the descending colon down towards the rectum. So basically, just talk about the big picture of the small intestine and the large intestine. The small intestine from the duodenum, the next step of the process is the proximal jejunum. Yes?
Where's the splenic flexure there?
The splenic flexure is this. Right? Yep. That's the transverse colon. Spleen sits here. So that's nicknamed the splenic flexure there. So small intestine, we're thinking about a lot of absorption that's taking place here. And in the proximal jejunum, you have more absorption taking place than the distal ileum. Makes sense, right? Because the proximal jejunum is closer to the source of where the food is passing through the stomach, passing through the duodenum, and then you have the jejunum. So the structure of the jejunum looks different than the ileum. The proximal jejunum is larger in diameter and has more folds. Same thing we talked about before, surface area. Increasing the surface area makes it more effective for absorbing more of the good stuff and passing more of the bad stuff downstream. But the distal ileum, you're almost in the colon at this point. This is the distal ileum here. So at this point, at the distal ileum, all the good stuff is gone. So all that's really left at that point is poop and water. So then the large intestine, the main purpose of the large intestine is to absorb water and secrete mucus. So that works out pretty well since there's nothing really left at that point for food and water, like we said in the distal ileum. So the large intestine absorbs that water. Okay, that's why you become dehydrated pretty quickly if you have diarrhea, because everything's passing through you so quickly, you're not allowing yourself to reabsorb the water in your large intestine. So that water is being passed out instead of being reabsorbed, so you can get dehydrated pretty quickly. And it also makes sense that it would secrete mucus, because like we said before, it's solid waste at that point. So if you didn't have the mucus, it'd be like a brick coming out. That'd be a bad day. Right? Now for the small intestine, you have two layers of muscle. You have a circular layer, and you have a longitudinal layer that's traveling the whole distance of the 20 feet of the small intestine. And the purpose of this is, like we said before, you swallow light food once, you swallow and forget it. So the purpose of these muscles is for peristalsis. I know you guys heard that before, peristalsis. Peristalsis is simply the action of pushing that food downstream to the small intestine. So what happens, it's a lot like taking a tube of toothpaste and squirting out the toothpaste. It's like if you squirt it from behind, you let some come out, and then you grab it in and squirt some out, you grab it in and squirt some out, and you just keep going down the line until it all comes out. So that's what the small intestine is doing, is constricting those circular fibers, constricting behind the bolus of food, trying to push it downstream. And then those longitudinal fibers are also sort of pushing downstream as well to get this funneling to push it down towards the large intestine. So the small intestine is always working. There's always some sort of peristalsis taking place with the small intestine. For the large intestine, you also have peristalsis, but it's not nearly as dynamic, because if you'll notice, you've got these bands of muscle that travel along the large intestine. And these guys are called tinea coli. You're going to ask me to spell it. Tinea. Can't remember. Tinea, I think it's T-E-N-E-A-E. I think. It might be on the structures to identify sheet also. But it's called tinea coli. It means the ribbon of the colon. So it's the long, thin muscle. There's three of them. It's the long, thin muscle along the large intestine. So it serves the same purpose as the longitudinal muscle for the small intestine. It's helping to push the feces downstream towards the rectum. But the fact that you only have three of these bands tell you the peristalsis for the large intestine doesn't happen that often. Right? So some people it happens a couple times a day. Some people it happens once every other day. Right? So every time that this is happening for the large intestine, that's pushing the feces downstream, and that's when you get the urge to go to the bathroom, is when you have enough of the solid waste down towards the sigmoid and the reservoir that's in the rectum. So for a while, it's just sort of collecting and pushing it downstream until there's enough to signify that you need to go, and then you go. Because otherwise, if it was like the small intestine, you would have peristalsis 24/7. With the large intestine, you could never get out of the bathroom. It would be constantly coming out. Sounds like fun, right? Good times. We mentioned that the distal ileum dumps the poop in the water into the large intestine. The first portion of the large intestine is nicknamed the cecum. You see it here. It means blind pouch. Just throwing that out there. Blind pouch, first part of the large intestine. But now again, the distal ileum, as it's dumping its contents into the large intestine, there is a sphincter. Again, same purpose. It sort of systematically regulates how much is being passed into the cecum. And this is called the ileocecal valve. Makes sense. Ileum, cecum. It's the valve in between. Serving the same purpose as the pyloric sphincter, serving the same purpose as the major duodenal papilla. It's called the ileocecal valve. If we're lucky, we'll be able to see that. I can't remember if we have one that's cut open or not upstairs. But then at this point, you're also introduced to where the appendix should be. Now, not everybody has one, but if you do have one, it usually hangs from that anterior tinea coli muscle on the cecum, and then hangs down to the pelvis. That's a normal position for the appendix. Now we're getting ready to switch gears to the blood supply. Do you guys need to take 5? We still got a little bit to go. You want to take 5? Big lecture today, right? A lot of stuff. Let's just take 5. We'll start back at 25 after. If it makes you feel better, we cover this stuff for the med class in about 4 labs. So it's a lot of stuff, but we're hitting a lot of highlights. We're not going super in depth and anything. Sure. Yeah.
For the inguinal lip, it's like the folding over of the external oblique fascia, right?
Yep.
So is that referring to like Cantor's and Scarpa's fascia, or is that like a
No, it's
separate
actually
fascia?
it's the fascia. I guess you would really say it's the tendon at that point because it's the actual connection of the muscle downstream. It's just considered fascia at that point. But I mean by the letter of the law, it would be the tendon.
Okay. There's a picture that I was confused on. So for this, when you said that it's retroperitoneal,
It is.
wouldn't this be in front? Because isn't this the
That's the parietal peritoneum there.
peritoneum? So isn't this in front of it?
Well, what you got to think about is that you are behind the peritoneum. Okay, so the intra-abdominal contents would be in here. So that means the visceral peritoneum would be on these organs. That's the wall, so that's the parietal. This is behind the wall. So that's retroperitoneum. I mean, that's all the external muscles.
So these were behind me.
So you can be retroperitoneal and be in front of the body. So I know that don't think of retro meaning that you have to be necessarily just behind like an anatomical position. That just means you are behind the parietal peritoneum. And you have parietal peritoneum wrapped all the way to the front of the body. So in reality, the rectus abdominis is retroperitoneal because it is outside of that parietal peritoneum.
Okay. I was thinking like it has to be more
Right. Yeah,
posterior.
right. But retro doesn't mean posterior. It just means behind, outside of. Does that make sense?
I think so. And the cream step, is that right? The internal oblique becomes that,
Yes,
right?
that's
I don't know
right.
why I wrote external for some reason.
External
I don't know if I
becomes
heard it wrong.
external fascia.
Okay,
Internal becomes
that.
that.
Okay. That was our major ones.
Cool.
Yeah. Oh, one more. So the inferior epigastric goes into the superior epigastric artery.
It does.
The internal thoracic goes into the superior epigastric. So you said it's a connection between, you said the subclavian.
That's right, the subclavian and the
All the way
external
down.
iliac.
Okay.
Yeah, it connects the neck and the pelvis by that one long chain.
In the external. Okay.
That's a good for anastomosis, like if there's a blockage somewhere in the middle, you've got neck blood or pelvic blood.
Okay.
It can work its way back.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure.
Now, we talk about the blood supply for these regions, the foregut, the midgut, and the hindgut. There is a big rule of threes that will take you a long way when you go through this class and then your next class. Okay, so understand this rule of threes, learn it. All right, don't just memorize it, you need to learn this. So off of the anterior abdominal aorta, you have three major branches. And those branches are called the celiac trunk, the superior mesenteric artery, and the inferior mesenteric artery. Okay, celiac trunk, superior mesenteric artery, and inferior mesenteric artery. Those are the three main branches off of the anterior abdominal aorta. Now, off of those three major branches, you have three major branches. So that's why this rule of threes works out very well. So for this slide, all we're looking at is telling you that the celiac trunk supplies the foregut, the superior mesenteric artery supplies the midgut, and the inferior mesenteric artery supplies the hindgut. Okay, that's super big picture, but we're going to go into more detail. So celiac is foregut, SMA, midgut, IMA is hindgut, right? Now off of the celiac trunk, like we said, there's three major branches off of the celiac, there's three major branches off the SMA, and there's three off the IMA. There's other branches that go downstream as well. If you'll remember, we had more organs associated with the foregut than we did with the midgut or the hindgut, right? Because you got the liver that's out there, you got the stomach, the pancreas, the gallbladder, etc. All that stuff needs blood supply. So they are branches that come off of either the celiac trunk or of a branch off of a branch that continues downstream. So let's focus on the three that come off of the celiac trunk first, okay? Here's the celiac trunk. And from this view, this just comes straight out towards you. This is a lot like the hub of a bicycle tire where you have the spokes that are communicating with it. It's not very long at all. I mean, it's maybe a 1/4 inch long. The whole purpose of it is to come off of the anterior abdominal aorta and then split into those three branches. The first branch that you see is here called the left gastric. It tells you that it goes to the stomach. So it goes to the left side of this smaller curvature, the lesser curvature of the stomach. So there's a left gastric. The squiggle one you see behind here is called the splenic, because it travels to the spleen. And then the one that goes over towards the right is called the common hepatic. Common hepatic, and it's named common because it tells you it's going to split off into more proper branches towards the liver. So there is a left gastric, there is a splenic, and there is a common hepatic that come off of the celiac trunk. That's big picture, right? That's rule of threes, big picture. So again, here's that celiac trunk. Here's the left gastric going to the lesser curvature of the stomach on the left side. Here's the splenic cut away. So let's focus more on the other side for a second. You have the common hepatic. That's the third of these three that come off the celiac trunk. So at this point, after the common hepatic comes off, you have what's called a gastroduodenal. A gastroduodenal artery that will come off of here. Don't think they have it listed on this slide. It might be on the next one. The gastroduodenal they've got it a little bit here that you just see like the small hub of it, but it shows it a little bit better on the next slide. But after you have the gastroduodenal artery come off, the common simply changes names to proper. You see it here? So common becomes proper after the gastroduodenal branch comes off. And then from there, these arteries really follow the biliary tree. Remember how we had a right-left hepatic duct that were draining the bile from the liver? At this point, the proper hepatic splits into a right and left hepatic artery, following the biliary tree. Remember how we had the cystic duct over here draining the gallbladder? There's also a cystic artery that follows the cystic duct, and it goes back to the gallbladder. So it sounds like it's just a lot of stuff, but if you remember the biliary tree, you understand that setup. The blood supply in that area you should understand as well, because they really just share the names and they share the paths. So common hepatic gives off gastroduodenal. Common hepatic changes names to proper hepatic. And then the proper hepatic splits into a right-left hepatic. There's also a cystic. A lot of times the cystic will come off of the right hepatic, and that makes sense because the right hepatic vessel is the closest one to the gallbladder. So it makes sense that it would come off of that closest vessel. A lot of names, a lot of terms, but the big picture of it, does it make sense to you? Sort of that formation? Now again, the left gastric, I think that's pretty self-explanatory. Here's the gastroduodenal, short little branch that comes down and splits. I don't want you to get caught up into the rest of this. I just want you to see it to understand there's a huge anastomosis around this area. You can see these names, pancreaticoduodenal. Ooh, what a name, right? But the name tells you everything. Pancreas duodenal. Okay, so these guys are feeding this anastomosis with the head of the pancreas sitting in that C loop of the duodenum. So this is just filling in, supplying a good bit of the head of the pancreas and a lot of the duodenum. Okay? But again, gastroduodenal and all of those guys are coming off from that gastroduodenal. You also see, again, the splenic. You see how curved and how tortuous this is. That happens 100% of the time. I've never seen a splenic artery that is just straight. Never seen that. Splenic always comes off and has these dips and these humps as it works its way out. And it's also got these smaller pancreatic branches that come off and feed the body and the tail of the pancreas. So you can see those guys back here. It's sort of posterior, but you can see those branches coming off feeding the pancreas. So while it's called the splenic artery, that's its destination. That's where the bulk of that blood supply goes. It's still giving little branches down towards the pancreas as well. Now the midgut. Remember we said that the SMA, the superior mesenteric artery, supplies the midgut. Now the SMA, superior mesenteric artery, that name may not really mean anything to you, but if you'll remember back to the root of the mesentery, remember we said that's the parietal peritoneum that stretches from the posterior wall, wraps around the organ, and comes back to the posterior wall. The superior mesenteric artery comes off of the abdominal aorta just above the mesentery. That's why it's called superior mesenteric. The root of it comes off just above the root of the mesentery. So here's the superior mesenteric artery. It has three major branches to follow the rule. You have an ileocolic, makes sense, distal ileum and colon, right? So there's an ileocolic, a right colic that goes to the ascending colon, and then a middle colic that goes to the transverse colon. So ileocolic, right colic, middle colic, all coming off of the SMA. That's the rule of threes. Now notice also that here along the inner rim of the colon, that a new vessel has been formed. This is part of that anastomosis, and this is called the marginal artery. It's running along the inner margin, the inner rim for the large intestine. So this way, branches from the right colic could stretch downward, branches from the ileocolic could stretch upward, and then they anastomose. Again, another great backup plan. This will happen all the way around the large intestine down towards the rectum. Okay? So ileocolic, right colic, middle colic, supplying all of the large intestine. Now one thing that we didn't look at is we talk about the blood supply to the small intestine. Remember we said that the organs in this area are this portion of the large intestine that we just talked about, but also all of the small intestine, except for the first couple pieces of the duodenum. So what's happening here? After the superior mesenteric artery gives off the ileocolic branch, the superior mesenteric changes names just to the mesenteric. And that's important to us because remember we said the root of the SMA is above the mesentery. That's why it's called the superior mesentery. After it's done with its large intestine part, the ileocolic, it changes names to mesentery because it runs inside of the mesentery. It's no longer above it, it's in the mesentery. And that's important to us because remember again what we said the mesentery does. It connects the small intestine to the body wall, and it provides that bridge for the vessels, the nerves, and the lymphatics to bring back and forth. So at this point, the mesenteric artery then fans out into tons of these smaller branches to supply the jejunum. what starts back up top?
The thing outside way before the polycarpet.
It does. I mean, it's very easy to have branches that are coming off to supply the mesenteric. Absolutely. Yeah. We just say a general rule. We just try to find a cutoff point for it. So a general rule is that after it gives off the ileocolic, then it supplies the small intestine. But is it possible for some branches to come off prior? Absolutely. Absolutely. You're talking about this piece here?
Yeah, and all that pieces of that.
Right, we'll talk about those in just a second.
Spoiler.
No, it's a neat setup how it works.
Just to clarify,
Uh-huh.
the different branches are not the legal color. Artery, the right color artery, and the middle color artery are all artery.
This is called the margin. And the marginal is formed by the ileocolic, by the right, and by the middle, and by some of these other branches that you'll see that come off with the behind it as well. But now, we're not going to get into the specifics of which part of the small intestine is being supplied, because let's just hold it big picture. We'll call it mesenteric, understanding that it is the SMA simply changing names to the mesenteric once it runs inside the mesenteric. Okay? Now the hindgut. The hindgut, remember we said it's supplied by the inferior mesenteric artery. And the IMA supplies the regions from the splenic flexure downstream. So there is a left colic, which extends back upward to reach that splenic flexure. So there's a left colic. There is a sigmoid, which a lot of time the sigmoid can be more than one. So the S-shaped portion of the large intestine is nicknamed the sigmoid. So it's possible, as you see here, to have 2 or 3 of these sigmoidal branches. That's very normal. Because think about it, there's a sigmoid mesocolon, so those little guys are funneling through that mesocolon to get out to the large intestine. So at that point, after you have the left colic and the sigmoid, all that's left at that point is for the IMA to simply change names to the superior rectal and head down towards the rectum. So left colic, sigmoid, and then superior rectal. Those are the 3 branches off of the IMA, if you go back to that big picture rule of 3s. And that's supplying the hindgut, descending colon down to the rectum. Left colic, sigmoidal, could be more than one, and superior rectal. And again, you see how these guys are also forming this marginal artery, just the anastomosis of all 6 of these branches, the 3 from the SMA, the 3 from the IMA, and they're running along the inner rim of the large intestine. Now, as you pointed out a second ago with the small intestine, we had some of these loops. Some were bigger and some were smaller. There's a network that happens here. These are called arcades and vasa recta. What an arcade is a big loop. Okay, so here you see the arterial arcade. It's talking about these loops that occur from some of the bigger vessels as we travel out towards the small intestine. Here you see the arcades here. These loops are getting a little bit larger. So if you go back to this slide, you'll see here, these long loops that you were talking about before, those are arcades.
Yeah, I was wondering how that doesn't get lost.
How does it not get lost? It's all being funneled to the same place, but blood can take many different paths to get there. But since you have the arterial pressure pushing behind, it's all eventually going to the same, the same direction. So there's no regurgitation. But then the vasa recta means straight vessel. So these are the vessels, excuse me, these are the vessels that come off of the arcades and then travel straight into the gut itself. They may be longer, they may be shorter, but the vasa recta are the straight vessels that come off of the arcades and they go straight into the organ, straight into the small intestine. They come off of the mesenteric. Yes. Now if you're talking large intestine, they do come off the margin. Yes. Off the large intestine, they are off the margin. But for the small intestine, they're off the mesenteric. But remember, mesenteric was nothing more than the SMA changing names once it travels inside the mesenteric. Now there's a venous drainage for this area as well. Of course, if we have the arteries, we have to talk about the venous drainage. So there are veins that drain the small intestine. They are nicknamed the same name as the artery, so it's very straightforward. There's right colic, there's ileocolic, there's middle, left colic, sigmoidal, superior rectal. All the names of the arteries has a vein that follows suit with it, so it's great. Even bigger veins or bigger arteries like the IMA and the SMA, there's an inferior mesenteric vein. There's a superior mesenteric vein. They run parallel to each other. So the names and that setup should be pretty similar to you. But I do want you to notice something here. You have a superior mesenteric vein and you have an inferior mesenteric vein. Okay, so the superior mesenteric is draining the midgut. The inferior mesenteric is draining the hindgut because the artery supplies those regions, right? Eventually, this blood supply will work its way back up to the liver, not back into the aorta. Remember how we said that blood is destined in the vein to travel back to the heart so it can pick up the oxygenated blood and be sent back downstream. This is a little different. This is gut blood. This is small intestine blood. This is large intestine blood, right? So during all of this processing, all this digestion, you're taking some of the contents, some of the good stuff, for lack of better terms, from that, and you're funneling it back into the bloodstream. But before you do that, you have to process it, okay? So the liver, not only does it produce the bile, the liver is a big detox area as well, right? So all the good stuff and the bad stuff that we eat gets funneled through our intestines and it tries to be absorbed as best it can. There's some things that are just not absorbable, so they get left into the bloodstream. That blood in the gut is then passed to the liver to be detoxified to make that blood usable again. So then after it is detoxified, then it gets passed from the liver back into the inferior vena cava to take it back to the heart. You don't want to take toxic blood back to the heart. That's sepsis. We've already talked about that. That ain't good, right? So you want to take all of this blood, the good and the bad that's associated with it, detoxify it if need be, and then pass it back into the bloodstream. Now there's one major vein here called the portal vein. The portal vein is the big communication of all these smaller veins that drain back into the liver. You'll see that the superior mesenteric vein forms half of it. You'll see that the splenic vein forms the other half of it. Now the inferior mesenteric vein, even though it drains the hindgut, the inferior mesenteric vein should drain into the splenic, and then the splenic carries its contents across. So if you talk about formation of portal vein, it's just two veins, superior mesenteric and splenic, not the inferior mesenteric. It drains into the splenic, and then the splenic carries its contents back across. But this is called the portal vein because this area of the liver is called the porta hepatis, the doorway for the liver. It's kind of like the hilum of the lung, if you remember that. That was sort of the business area for the lung, where the bronchi pass back and forth, the pulmonary vessels pass back and forth. This is the business area for the liver, but it's just called the doorway in this case. It's the porta hepatis. So the big vein, the portal vein, is the big vein within that portal region. But if you guys ever read anything about portal venous drainage, this is what it's talking about. It's talking about the gut blood and the detoxification process with the liver. Now the hepatic portal triad, since we just talked about the portal region, there are three things that are sitting in this hepatic portal triad that are communicating up here with the liver. The portal vein is the large posterior structure that we just talked about. And there's two other smaller structures on the anterior side we've already talked about. One of them was the proper hepatic artery, and one of them is the common bile duct. So portal vein, proper hepatic artery, and common bile duct are the three structures that form this portal triad, the hepatic portal triad. And to bring that home even further, when we talked about the drainage of the lesser sac out into the greater, we said you stick your finger in that omental foramen, and then if you pushed your finger up, you would be pushing against the lesser omentum.
When you first put your finger in that omental foramen, you're actually running your finger just underneath that portal triad. So if you pushed up, you'd be hitting the portal vein, just to kind of give you an idea of where you'd be at the body.
Now, I will tell you, this is a nice diagram, this is a nice setup. There's a lot of variation that takes place in this region. There's a lot of variation. As complex and as important as the heart is very simple. Its variations are very easy to figure out. Gallbladder surgery can be more fatal sometimes than cardiac surgery. Excuse me, and it's because of the variations that you have up here. So as I say, I would look for these structures if you're doing your dissection, come August or whenever we do it. I would dissect this area first and then go back and try to make some sense out of it. Okay, I would then go back and try to figure out, well, what's going where, because there's a lot of variation. Some of these vessels can circle back around underneath the portal vein. Sometimes the cystic artery can come off way down here from gastroduodenal, things like that. So there's a ton of variation that happens up here. Ton of variation. But the big picture, the triad, is usually pretty standard. The portal vein, the common bile duct, and the proper hepatic artery. Those are usually pretty standard. The rest of it can have some pretty big variation to it. Now the last couple slides that we talk about are innervations down in this area. I know we talked about vagus before. We talked about its pathway with the left vagus traveling anterior with the esophagus, the right vagus posterior, as they work their way down towards the stomach. Well, then at this point, once the vagus reaches the stomach, it changes names to the gastric plexus, right? It's still the vagus nerve, it's just changing names because it's running around the stomach. But if you remember, vagus is responsible for quite a bit down in the belly. Vagus extends all the way down to the splenic flexure, which happens to be the end of the midgut. Vagus is supplying the parasympathetic, because remember there's 4 cranial nerves that have parasympathetic. Vagus is supplying the parasympathetics for the belly all the way down to the splenic flexure, like we just said, the end of the midgut. So when you think of the vagus nerve and you think of the parasympathetic component, this is sort of the calming effect, right? So this is the rest and digest phase for the belly. So a lot of the digestion, for lack of better terms, is being stimulated by the vagus nerve, because that again is the rest and digest phase. When you think of fight or flight, you're thinking of the sympathetics. You're thinking of ramping up the system, right? So on the next slide, you're seeing some of the sympathetics. Sympathetic chain with the ganglia, providing sympathetic fibers to the ganglia associated with the celiac trunk, the superior mesenteric, and the inferior mesenteric arteries. So this is where you're getting the opposite effect. You're getting that ramped up, like we talked about, the fight or flight. Well, what I want you to notice here is that you've got your vagal trunks. Okay, so you've got the right and left vagus as they travel downstream. You've got branches coming off of those trunks that are hitting the ganglion associated with the celiac trunk. It's called the celiac ganglion. So you're taking parasympathetic component from the vagus and applying it to that ganglion. You'll also notice here that you have the sympathetic trunk. It has a nerve that synapses with the celiac ganglion. It's giving a sympathetic component to that ganglion. That's going to happen at the celiac ganglion, the superior mesenteric ganglion, and the inferior mesenteric ganglion. The point of that is that means that if each of those 3 ganglions, each of those hubs, you have a sympathetic and a parasympathetic component that can then be spread throughout the abdominopelvic cavity. Kind of a big deal. We're not going to get much more into the innervations down here other than the big picture with it. Okay? Because that's a lot to digest, no pun intended. Don't laugh at that, seriously. That was not meant to be. I actually did not plan that joke. It was not good. Just telling you up front. What questions do you have? It's a full lecture today, but it's a lot of stuff. It's a lot of good stuff. It's just a lot of stuff. What questions do you have? Where are you stuck? We still got 10 minutes. Yes?
This word in reference to marginal, or like what is that word?
The anastomosis, in this case, anastomosis just means a merger, a joining together of more than one vessel. So like before, we talked about major joints had anastomoses from 3, 4, 5 different vessels, that way if one is blocked, the other 3 or 4 can still pick up the slack and supply blood to that region. That's what you're seeing here. You're seeing a ton of these anastomoses by way of either the marginal artery for the large intestine, or these arcades, more so with the small intestine. It's just a big backup plan. What other questions do you have? This is one of those lectures you probably have to go back and listen to it again. It's a lot of stuff, but it's a lot of good stuff, like I said. And this is stuff that you will see again. Hint, hint, wink, wink. I love you. You're gonna see it again. I can't tell you enough. You're gonna see this again. No other questions? Okay. I'll see you Thursday.